So, between 1500 and 1867, roughly 12.5 million human beings were kidnapped from their homes in Africa, shoved onto ships, and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to work for free for their entire lives, and their children's lives, and their children's children's lives. And somehow, most history classes cover this entire 400-year catastrophe in about 2 paragraphs, a sad picture, and a worksheet. We're going to do better than that. Fair warning, this video is going to be honest. Not sanitized for the standardized test, honest. Actually honest. Parts will be hard to hear. Parts will make you angry, and some parts will make you go, wait, that recently. This is not ancient history. This is a story about money, power, cruelty, and the people who fought back against all of it. Let's start at the beginning. And no, the beginning is not what you think. Here's where we need to clear up the first big misconception. A lot of people, thanks to several centuries of terrible education, picture pre-colonial Africa as some kind of empty wilderness where nothing was going on. Which is a bit like looking at the Manhattan skyline and going, nice campsite. Because by the 1400s, Africa had empires. Big ones, ones that would make several European kingdoms look like community theater productions. Take the Mali Empire. Under Mansa Musa, it became so wealthy that when Musa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought along 60,000 people and 80 camels carrying tons of gold. Along the way, he handed out so much gold that he accidentally crashed the economy of Egypt. For over a decade, one guy, on a road trip, broke an economy by being too generous. Then there was Timbuktu, not just a funny word your geography teacher used, but one of the great intellectual centers of the world. Its university had scholars studying mathematics, astronomy, and law at a time when plenty of European cities were still struggling with don't throw sewage into the street. The Kingdom of Benin had walls longer than the Great Wall of China. The Kingdom of Congo had sophisticated trade networks, politics, and diplomacy. Africa was not sitting around waiting to be discovered by guys in funny hats on boats. Now, enter the Europeans. Portugal had a problem every European power shared. They wanted stuff. Gold, spices, a sea route to Asia without middlemen. So Prince Henry, who history called the Navigator, despite doing almost none of his own navigating, started sending ships down Africa's west coast. They found gold, then trade, and then something else. People. People who could be made to work. Quick but important clarification. Slavery was not new. It existed in Africa, Europe, and Asia. The Romans had slaves. African kingdoms had systems of forced labor. This is not a justification. It's context. Because what happened next was not just more slavery. What the Europeans built was something the world had never seen. An industrialized, racialized, transatlantic machine designed to turn human beings into fuel for an economic engine. At a scale that dwarfed everything before it. And the engine that powered it? It wasn't hate. Not at first. It was sugar. Sugar changed everything. That is not an exaggeration. When Europeans realized sugarcane could grow in the Caribbean and Brazil, they discovered the 15th century equivalent of oil. Everyone wanted it. Nobody could get enough. The profit margins were obscene. Buy a mansion from one shipment levels of profitable. One tiny, enormous problem. Growing sugar was absolutely miserable work. The planting, cutting, milling, boiling, backbreaking, dangerous, relentless. This was industrial labor in tropical heat before labor rights was a concept. Europeans tried indigenous labor first, but Caribbean indigenous populations were devastated by European diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Entire civilizations collapsed within decades. Some islands lost 90% of their population. Plan B, indentured servants from Europe. But they had rights, contracts, expiration dates, and kept dying in tropical heat because people from England are not optimized for 12-hour shifts in Caribbean sugar fields. Shocking. Plan C was horrifying. European powers looked at Africa and essentially said, We need workers who survive the climate, who we can force to work indefinitely, and who we can replace when they die. Human trafficking became a business model. Enter the triangle trade. Called that because it was shaped like a triangle. Creative naming was not a European strength. Leg 1. Europe to Africa. Ships sailed to West Africa loaded with guns, textiles, iron, alcohol. These goods were exchanged with African coastal kingdoms for enslaved people. And yes, some African leaders participated. Not because Africans were collectively worse than Europeans, but because the system was designed like a trap. Cooperate and get guns. Refuse and your rival kingdom gets armed instead. It was game theory with human lives, and the house always won. Leg 2. Africa to the Americas. The Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans loaded onto ships 6 to 12 weeks across the Atlantic. We'll get to that. Leg 3. The Americas to Europe. Products of slave labor. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, rum. Shipped to Europe at massive profits. Those profits bought more goods. Shipped back to Africa for more enslaved people. And the triangle spun. For 300 years. To understand the scale, Caribbean sugar colonies generated more revenue for Britain than all 13 American colonies combined. Little Jamaica was worth more to Britain than the entirety of Canada. An island smaller than Connecticut, producing more wealth than a landmass from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Banks that exist today were built on slave trade profits. Insurance companies still operating got their start insuring slave ships. Cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes were essentially built on this money. And every European power had a justification ready. Portugal, saving souls. Britain, Africans were naturally suited to labor. France, commerce. Spain, the Pope said it was fine. Everyone had a reason. Funny how the reasons always benefited the people making money. This is where the conversational tone gets harder to maintain. Because what happened during the Middle Passage was so systematically cruel that describing it casually feels wrong. But describing it in detached academic language feels like looking away. So we're going to look straight at it. It started with capture. Enslaved Africans, men, women, children were taken through raids, warfare, or kidnapping. From there, many walked hundreds of miles in chains to reach the coast. At the coast, they were held in stone dungeons like Elmina Castle in Ghana, which still stands today, for weeks or months until a ship arrived. Then they were loaded aboard. Below deck, people were chained in rows, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, in spaces where many couldn't stand or even sit fully upright. The space per person was roughly the size of a coffin. A ship carried 300 to 700 people in a hold designed for maybe 100. Some captains practiced tight packing, maximum bodies, higher death rate, but the math still worked. Others practiced loose packing, more space, fewer deaths, more to sell. Both treated human beings as an inventory optimization problem. The voyage lasted 6 to 12 weeks. Disease spread constantly: dysentery, smallpox, scurvy. The air below deck became so toxic that candles literally sputtered out from lack of oxygen. 15 to 20% didn't survive. Historians estimate between 1.5 and 2 million people died during the Middle Passage. Bodies thrown into the Atlantic. For survivors, and survivors is doing heavy lifting, arrival wasn't relief. It was a new beginning to something terrible. At Caribbean, Brazilian, or American ports, enslaved Africans went through what traders called seasoning, as if human beings were ingredients. 1 to 3 years of being broken into the system. New names, languages forbidden, identity punished, then sold. At public auctions where buyers inspected them the way someone might inspect a used car, checking teeth, feeling muscles, assessing health. That was the system, and it ran like clockwork. Plantation life depended on where you were, what crop you grew, and who claimed to own you. But nothing about it was good. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were the deadliest. Average working life after arrival: 7 to 9 years. Not before retirement. before death. 18-hour days, dangerous milling equipment, boiling sugar in vats of scalding liquid. Plantation owners calculated it was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to improve conditions. That wasn't a side effect. That was the business plan, written in ledgers, with math. Cotton plantations in the American South worked differently. Enslaved people were long-term investments, which sounds like an improvement until you realize it meant controlled reproduction and deliberately splitting families. A mother in Virginia could wake up and find her children sold to Mississippi. No goodbye, just a transaction in someone's accounting book. Slave codes kept everything airtight. No property, no testimony in court, no legal marriage, no literacy. Teaching an enslaved person to read was criminal. Because literacy is dangerous when your system depends on people not knowing they have options. The justifications evolved with the times. First, we're Christianizing them, doing them a favor. Then, as Enlightenment ideas about liberty spread, that excuse stopped working. So the justification shifted to race. Entire academic fields invented to argue Africans were biologically inferior. Papers published, lectures given. Universities taught it as science. A manufactured lie designed to make an economic system look like natural order. But here's the thing about building a system on dehumanizing millions of people. Sooner or later, those people fight back. There's this comfortable myth that enslaved people were passive, that they waited for kind abolitionists to set things right. That myth is not just wrong. It's an insult to millions of people who resisted every single day for centuries. Resistance started on the ships. Revolts were recorded on roughly 1 in 10 slave voyages. People who were chained, starved, and outnumbered decided to fight anyway, in the middle of an ocean, on a ship they didn't know how to sail. Most revolts failed. They never stopped happening. On plantations, resistance had 1,000 faces. Quiet resistance. Working at half speed, breaking tools accidentally, feigning illness, sabotaging crops, poisoning food. These acts were so widespread that plantation owners lived in perpetual paranoia. Every stomachache might be an assassination attempt. Every broken plow might be sabotage. They built their system on the idea that black people were inferior and content, then spent every waking moment terrified of what those inferior, content people might do. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Others ran. The Underground Railroad, neither underground nor a railroad, became one of history's most extraordinary resistance networks. And then there was Harriet Tubman. Tubman escaped slavery in 1849. Most people would have called it a day. Tubman went back 13 times. Into slave territory, led roughly 70 people to freedom. She carried a revolver and told anyone thinking about turning back that they'd be making a permanent decision. Harriet Tubman did not do motivational speeches. She did ultimatums. In the Caribbean and South America, maroon communities of escaped enslaved people carved out independent territories. Jamaica's Maroons fought the British Empire, redcoats, cannons, everything, to a standstill and negotiated a treaty. That's like punching a bear and getting it to sign a contract. And it worked. In Brazil, Zumbi led the Quilombo dos Palmares. 20,000 people, lasted nearly a century. An independent African-descended society inside colonial Brazil. The Portuguese sent expedition after expedition. Took them decades. And then there was Haiti. Turn the volume up for this one. Saint-Domingue, the French colony, now Haiti, was the single most profitable colony on Earth. 40% of Europe's sugar, 60% of its coffee. 500,000 enslaved Africans outnumbering whites 10 to 1. In 1791, Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who'd educated himself and developed military genius that made Napoleon nervous, helped lead the only fully successful large-scale slave revolution in recorded history. They rose up, fought the French planters, then Spain, then Britain, which sent 20,000 troops and lost most of them. Then Napoleon, who sent his largest overseas expedition ever because the idea of formerly enslaved people running their own country was apparently unacceptable to him. Napoleon sent his brother-in-law with 40,000 soldiers. Toussaint was captured through treachery, invited to negotiate, then arrested, and died in a freezing French prison. Napoleon thought that would end things. It did not. Dessalines and Christophe took over and demolished what was left of the French army. January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared independence. First free black republic, second independent nation in the Americas. The world's response? Punishment. France demanded 150 million gold francs, compensation for the property lost. The property was the people who freed themselves. Haiti, facing military threats, agreed. The debt wasn't settled until 1947. Haiti was paying France for the right to not be enslaved well into the 20th century. Your grandparents were alive. The abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery are two completely different things. And the timeline tells you how power actually works. Moral arguments against slavery existed for centuries. But abolition gained real traction when it became economically convenient. Britain abolished the trade in 1807. Not slavery, just the trade. Enslaved people in colonies stayed enslaved. Britain then patrolled the Atlantic to stop others, which sounds noble until you remember Britain had already transported 3.5 million people, and shutting down the trade gave its colonies a competitive advantage. Convenient that. Britain abolished slavery in 1833, but the government paid £20 million in compensation, not to the enslaved, to the slave owners. That debt wasn't repaid until 2015. Black British citizens were, through taxes, contributing to slave owner compensation until 9 years ago. France abolished slavery in 1848, for the second time, because France had abolished it during the Revolution, and then Napoleon reinstated it. Apparently, liberté, égalité, and fraternité came with terms and conditions. The United States needed a civil war killing 750,000 people. 13th Amendment, December 1865. Brazil was last in the Western Hemisphere, 1888. Also imported the most enslaved Africans, 5.5 million. Total timeline from first abolition laws to the last country ending slavery. About 85 years of debates, calculations, and what can charitably be called strategic foot dragging. And when slavery ended, the systems it created didn't vanish. In the US, slavery became sharecropping, black codes, convict leasing, basically slavery with extra steps. Then Jim Crow for another century. In the Caribbean and Latin America, generations of economic marginalization. In Africa, 4 centuries of damage created vulnerabilities Europeans exploited during the scramble for Africa. The machine stopped. The damage kept compounding. At the start, we said 12.5 million people were taken from their homes. Those weren't numbers on a ledger. Those were people with names. Olaudah Equiano, enslaved as a child, who bought his freedom and wrote one of the most powerful books ever published. Phyllis Wheatley, kidnapped at age 7, who became the first published African-American poet. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery, who became one of the greatest orators the English language has ever produced. For every name that survived, millions didn't. Not because those lives were less remarkable, but because the system was designed to erase them. The transatlantic slave trade was not a footnote. It was a 400-year system that reshaped 4 continents, built the Western economy, and created patterns of inequality measurable today. The cities, banks, universities, legal frameworks, racial categories, none of that appeared from nowhere. Understanding this isn't about guilt. Nobody alive chose this system. But understanding how it worked and what it left behind, that's not optional for anyone who wants to understand the world they're living in. At the start, we said most history classes cover this in 2 paragraphs and a worksheet. Now you know why that's not enough.